Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I see we have a nice, fairly large group of people here. Uh, we're going to be hearing Rami talk about Lebanon and then have, I hope, a good and informative discussion. Now, Rami, probably a lot of you know something about him. I'm going to give a brief introduction rather than one of those elaborate academic introductions. Rami is, I guess you would say, a public intellectual in the best sense, and an internationalist by outlook and by his circumstances. He is of Palestinian heritage and spends his time divided between Beirut, Lebanon, and the U.S., Cambridge, and New York. He's an author, a journalist, an academic. In Beirut, he's associated with the Lebanese Star newspaper, where he's been a columnist and an editor. And if you want to find out more, you can look him up online. But we also joked he's also a Red Sox fan, kind of unique in the Arab world for being a baseball fan, and maybe
Yankees fan.
Maybe it's a Yankee fan. I'm sorry. Yeah, I guess that's less depressing right now than being a Red Sox fan for sure. So Rami, you're going to introduce us to the sort of situation in Lebanon, set the scene, and hopefully fill in a lot of the blanks that people have. Everyone sort of paid attention to Lebanon when the big explosion took place, but before and since, most people are not very informed or knowledgeable about the social and political situation in Lebanon, which you and I both agree is pretty unique in the Arab world and maybe the whole world in terms of its political system, for better or worse, mostly for worse. So Rami, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you for hosting me, and thank you for everybody who's logged on for joining us. I've lived in Lebanon 3 times in my life, and this is the longest time. I've been there about 17 years now, and I go back and forth between New York and Cambridge, where I work for the American University of Beirut, and back in Beirut at the campus where I do my work, which is global outreach and partnerships around the world. And also I teach journalism, which is what I've done all my life. I've been a journalist, and I've been involved in Lebanon for most of my adult life, and as a journalist and a resident. And the place is quite a mess now, really. It's really one of the most complex and difficult political situations anywhere in the Middle East or anywhere in the world. And I'll make a couple of quick comments. First, to describe what the situation is for those who are not aware, and then why it happened, how it happened, and what this tells us about Lebanon and the Arab region. Because perhaps the most interesting thing to me about Lebanon today is that it is no longer an exceptional Arab country. It used to be different than all the other Arab countries. But that's no longer the case. It's now become one of many Arab countries where you have a increasingly poor population, a pauperized population, challenging and sometimes confronting and sometimes clashing with an increasingly militarized state, a government and state that cannot respond politically to the demonstrators who have been out in the streets since October, demanding a complete change in the political system and to get rid of this entire class of corrupt oligarchic leaders who've been there for 30 years. And the government doesn't seem to be able to make any response other than send in the troops with the tear gas canisters and shooting some people and arresting people, beating them up. And this is a situation now that has been at a standstill in since last October, when the uprising started. It's next month it'll be a year. And what's interesting is that this makes Lebanon similar to other Arab countries where you've had long-running mass popular uprisings. Sudan and Algeria both have been in situations like that for over a year. Iraq has been in a situation like that. So Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq today are the 4 Arab countries where huge numbers, hundreds of thousands, and sometimes millions of citizens have been out in the streets demanding that what's interesting, they're not just demanding that a policy be changed or they lower the price of something or the law is changed. They're demanding the entire political system, the entire political ruling elite, get the hell out of there, leave, either flee the country or resign and go to their homes or get arrested and go to jail or whatever. The demands of the enraged citizens in these 4 countries, which are reflected in less intense ways in other Arab countries like Morocco or Jordan or Mauritania or other places. The demands of the people of these countries now reflect a intense sense of what started out as anger because the citizens felt that the political elite was completely ignoring the needs of the people and allowing conditions to deteriorate in every sector of life, which I'll get to in a minute. But that anger continued to grow month after month after month as conditions got worse in every dimension of life and has now really become desperation and frenzy, that people are wits' end. And the reason is that in every dimension of life, and this applies to Lebanon, to Sudan, to Iraq, to Algeria, and to other Arab countries to a lesser extent, every dimension of life has seen a decline in the well-being of the average citizen and the average family, a serious decline. This means income, quality of life, economic quality of life, electricity. In many of these countries, electricity is only available 6, 8, 10 hours a day, maybe. In some places, only 3 or 4 hours a day. Food prices are increasing. Jobs are decreasing. There's very few new jobs available for the young graduates. Water quality is decreasing badly in most of these countries, and in many countries, there just isn't enough clean water and people have to adjust. Education quality is declining. The currency is collapsing. In Lebanon, the currency is worth about maybe a fifth of what it used to be worth a year ago. And the same isn't happening in many other Arab countries. So, and with all of these material problems, real suffering at the family level. You don't have electricity, you don't have a job, you don't have enough money to live decently, water, etc. With all of these problems, people complain and complain and complain, and nothing happens. So on top of the material suffering that impacts well over half the population of these countries, you also have the reality, which in my view is much worse than the material suffering. And this is the reality of a sense by the citizens that their government treats them like animals, like people who have no rights whatsoever. The governments don't care about their citizens. They don't listen to them. They don't try to serve them. They see them suffering and their lives deteriorating, and the government officials just go on with their games and their daily corrupt routines. And the reason is that most government officials don't feel any of the pain that ordinary citizens feel. They have water, they have electricity, they have jobs, they have nice cars. They don't have any of the problems that ordinary people have. And so what you have in Lebanon, and again throughout the region, is a growing polarization, a gap between the political elite that runs the country and the masses of the citizens who have no voice, who have no power, and who apparently have no rights. And this is why this decade of the last 10 years, from 2010 to 2020 now, this has been a decade of almost uninterrupted uprisings. It started, of course, in Tunisia and Egypt and the famous Arab Spring, as some people call it. And it's pretty much hasn't stopped since then. The uprisings have not all been big national dramatic ones like Egypt and Tunis and others were, but they've been nonstop demonstrations by an increasingly dissatisfied, enraged, and often desperate citizenry that has tried every possible means to demand from its government that the government govern properly and serve the people and give people just basic needs. People are not asking for wealth or power or revenge, or they're just asking to live a normal life, to get an education for their kids, to get reasonably priced food, have water in their taps, electricity when they turn on the light. That's all they want, and they're not getting it. And so therefore, people have been out on the streets. It's the last thing that they do. They don't know what else to do. Some people try to immigrate, and some can, but very few. So you've had masses and masses of citizens demonstrating on the streets and asking for the total removal of the political elites. Now, the Lebanese political elite is a little bit different than the other ones. Lebanon's system, and we're now in the 100th year anniversary of the creation of the modern state of Lebanon, which was done by a combination of local actors and the French, who were then the imperial power that was more or less in charge of the area of Lebanon and Syria. And they created Lebanon in a way that shared power. That means political positions, government ministers, cabinet, parliamentary ministers, seats, senior officials and bureaucrats, generals in the army, diplomats. All the important positions were shared, allocated among 18 different religious groups, Sunni and Shia and Druze and Maronite Christian and Greek Orthodox Christian and all kinds of different groups, including one seat in parliament for the Jews. There was a small Jewish population in Lebanon, which has pretty much all left. There's a few of them left, but very, very few. So they allocated this system of power sharing along confessional lines. And this back then was not such a strange thing, because that's at the end of the Ottoman Empire, much of society was governed by sectarian or tribal identities. The modern state had not taken hold very well. Some people more cruel than myself would say the modern state has not taken hold very well in Washington these days, but that's for a discussion for a different day. But what you had in Lebanon, a situation where from the birth of the country, governance was defined by religious power sharing. That system worked reasonably well from the 20s until around the 1970s, roughly. And Lebanon developed very well, and it was then very different than all the other Arab countries. Because of this power sharing system, you did not have one single central powerful dictator or autocratic authoritarian leader who controlled everything in the country, like you have in Egypt with Sisi today, or in Syria with Assad, or other countries. You had power shared among the different groups, and the president and the prime minister and the speaker of parliament, the three senior leaders, each from a different confessional group, were the sort of ruling triumvirate, and they could only rule based on what parliament said, and parliament was representing all the people in the country. So it worked reasonably well, and people's lives were improving steadily over the middle of this last century. And that's when Lebanon was different. It had more freedom, it had more tolerance, had more pluralism. You had nobody essentially came and told you, as they do in most Arab countries today, you're not allowed to read this book. You're not allowed to play this song. You can't stand up and talk about this political issue in public. As this is what happens in most of the authoritarian Arab countries, and it's happening in some authoritarian Western countries slowly in Europe and other places. That system is why that system of relative openness allowed the private sector to develop its full capacities, and more importantly, allowed two things to happen. A great education system developed with private schools as well as public schools, and some of the private schools, like the American University of Beirut or the French-speaking Saint Joseph University, these were started in the late 19th century, in 1870 and 1880. So they've been around for over a century and a half, and a lot of private schools. So you had great education system, and then you also had a great cultural life, theaters, cinemas, books, journalism, publishing houses, artwork, dance, all of the art forms, the cultural expression flourished because there was freedom to do so. And this relative freedom that people had allowed them to develop their full human potential. Whether you're a carpenter or a banker or a racing car driver or an engineer, whatever you did, you could develop your maximum human potential, and therefore you had really high levels of professionalism in Lebanon. Whereas in other Arab countries, you had constraints that were either government constraints, cultural constraints, tribal constraints, religious constraints, social constraints, security constraints. There was all kinds of pressures in all the other Arab countries that limited the ability of the average citizen, if you wanted to become a great dancer or a great writer or poet, express yourself, you couldn't do that in most Arab countries. And that's why people, when they wanted to flee other Arab countries, they came to Lebanon because they had the freedom to speak, to read, to write, to discuss with other people. And that's why publishing and the arts developed in Lebanon so well before they developed anywhere else in the region for the most part. Now, that system that worked reasonably well, and the economy grew reasonably well for about 40, 50, 60 years. And then you had the Civil War from 75 to 90. And then after the Civil War, the Syrians came in and ran Lebanon for another about 15 years, I think it was, or 20 years. And then the Syrians finally left in 2005. So they ran it for about 15 years. And between the Civil War and the Syrian control of the country, the old system gradually fell apart. And what happened in that period from 1990 to 2015, from 1975, at the beginning of the war, to 2015, what happened in those 40 years is that the old power sharing, relatively tolerant, relatively pluralistic system gradually collapsed because warlords took over. People during the war and right after solved things by the gun, assassinations and explosions. And then the Syrian rule for 15 years created great corruption and took away any power from the Lebanese. The Syrians made all the decisions. And then the Syrians finally were thrown out in 2005. And by then, the old warlords who had fought during the war and under Syrians' tutelage had run the country and pretty much turned it into a corrupt oligarchic kleptocracy. Those warlords, many of whom are still in power today, like the president, Michel Aoun, like Samir Jaja, like Walid Jumblat, like Nabih Berri from Amal. They were not all warlords running militias, but they were leaders of political groups who had militias who fought, and many of them actually fought each other. And they then became, these people after the Syrians left, became head of the political groups that ran the country, and together they had total power. And this is the transition that happened that deprived Lebanon first of its pluralism and cultural dynamism and freedoms, and then deprived it of the capacity to keep developing and keep growing, because the people in power controlled the economy and controlled the guns and essentially allowed a very corrupt, inefficient system to develop that was reliant heavily, almost totally, on money flowing into the country from abroad, much of it from Lebanese expatriates, but much of it from tourism, from foreign investments, from remittances by workers overseas. So the Lebanese were not producing much in their economy. They just got lazy, and because the political system told people, don't worry about it, enjoy life. And because the political system was able to maintain a certain economic equilibrium for many decades, but underneath that surface veneer of a good life for everybody, what was happening was that the institutions of the state were hollowed out. Corruption, theft of money, inefficiency in the government. And that's when, about 10 years ago, the quality of services started to decline. The electricity system, the public transport, the education, the water, all these things started to decline because the government people were mostly corrupt and inefficient, and they didn't care about anything other than essentially amassing power and money and passing it on to their children and sharing it with the people of their own confessional religious group. That's a kind of a generalization, but that's how Lebanon got to the situation that it's in today. So what happened in the last 5-7 years or so is that the system completely hollowed out. The country ran out of foreign exchange. The government ran out of income. People stopped sending money into Lebanon from abroad because they saw that their money that was going into the banks was being taken by the central bank and given to the government to spend on government spending and creating greater deficits. And then finally, the banking system collapsed. The lira, the value of the lira last year, the banking system collapsed, the value of the Lebanese pound collapsed, the government's fiscal situation collapsed. The government didn't have money to pay its salary, so it just kept borrowing money from the central bank, and the central bank took the money out of the private bank deposits that ordinary people had put in there, their life savings. And then at one point, the whole system crashed last October, and the ordinary citizen could not get his or her money out of the banks. The banks stopped giving money to the depositors, and that's really when things really got bad, and people got outraged by what was happening. So this was all before the explosion. This was going back to last October, and that's when you had hundreds of thousands of citizens out in the street demonstrating and demanding that the government step down. So that brings Lebanon to the situation, and mass poverty and inequality. So about 50% of the Lebanese, say last October, about 50% of the Lebanese were poor, and the other 50 were middle class or higher. But that's a very unusual situation for a country that usually had only a very small poor percentage of the population of around 10%. Suddenly half the country was poor, and no government agencies were helping, providing support for the needy. And therefore people got more desperate and more angry. And what happened was, when you had electricity cuts where people were only getting electricity for, say, 10 hours a day, and water was short, when these material stresses on life started to hit many people all across the country, that's when the big public uprising started. And the interesting thing that happened then is that the old sectarian system was based on the fact that the Christian Maronites were always going to follow, say, this party, or the Shia were always going to follow Hezbollah and Amal, and the Druze were always going to follow Jumblat, and the Sunni were always going to follow Hariri or somebody else. That system started to break down because a lot of those sectarian followers, people who blindly followed their sectarian leaders, because their sectarian leaders in the previous half a century were able to help them get jobs and medical care and bank loans, whatever they needed. That system broke down. The government and the political elite no longer had the resources to help their own people, and many of their own people were suffering badly because of the incompetence of the government and its mismanagement and corruption that had brought the pain into every household. And that's where the uprisings started. And that's when Lebanon stopped being different. It became like most of the other countries in the Arab region in the last decade. It was characterized by an increasingly pauperized, poor citizenry that was challenging an increasingly militarized state. Thus that's the expression I use to capture what's going on. And there was no sign of either side budging. The government was not going to. The government made offers. You know, they made the parliament speaker, the president, the prime minister since last October, and some of those changed. Made offers to say, oh yeah, we'll change this law. We're going to launch a social support program for the poor. We're going to stabilize the economy. We're going to increase the anti-corruption agency's powers. They made all these concessions, but they never implemented any of them. And that's why the citizens got increasingly frustrated and started to saying, all of the political classes got to go. We won't accept anything except a complete recreation of a political system that is more participatory, more accountable, and more pluralistic, and based on social justice. Now, this is a situation that also mirrors much of the rest of the Arab world, where you have an enraged citizenry openly challenging its government and state, the state meaning the government, along with the armed forces, the security, all the institutions of the state. And this confrontation has pretty much come to a stalemate. The protesters are very strong. They represent well over half the population of the country. The government is very strong. It's been there and doing what it's been doing for the last 30, 40 years. They have power. They control the means of violence. They control the budget, even though there's very little money in the budget anymore, but they still have some fiscal power. And they control the instruments of state. There's a stalemate, and it's hard to know where this is going to go. The new thing in Lebanon, and I'll mention this and stop for a minute so we can get some questions if anybody has. The new thing is that given the stalemate and the fact that if nothing is done, the country is going to completely collapse and become a kind of Somalia situation, which Somalia in the 1990s completely collapsed and broke up into, there was no more central government. Warlords took control of different parts of the country. And for 20 years, Somalia was just a collection of local fiefdoms and tribal warlords in charge. Gradually, they reconstituted the central government, but it still only controls about, Mogadishu and maybe half the country, and the rest of the country is run by other tribal leaders and warlords and militias, and including some people from some of the terror groups like ISIS and Qaeda. So Somalia is kind of the worst case situation. And people worry in Lebanon that it might turn into a Somalia if nothing is done, or it might not quite go into the Somali picture, but go into the Venezuela picture, where there's a complete collapse of the currency and the government. And the opposition is very strong and nothing happens. And the people get increasingly poor and desperate, and they immigrate, and they live in poverty, and they don't know what to do. A kind of hollowing out of citizenship and statehood. So the new thing now, though, is that because people are, the citizens at least, not so much the state it seems, but the citizens are very aware that if nothing is done to stabilize the lira, restart economic growth, fix the electricity problem, fix the water and the garbage collection, improve the education system, help create new jobs, support the poor with welfare programs. If none of these things are done, then the country is going to totally collapse. And therefore, there's been immense pressure brought on the government now by the protesters, but also by international intervention through the personality of the French President Emmanuel Macron, who who visited Lebanon twice. I mean, so it's a sign of the incompetence and inefficiency and almost lack of legitimacy of the existing Lebanese government, that they had to be a foreign political leader who had to come in and try to help fix things, that the Lebanese couldn't do it on their own. But that's the situation that the country had reached, that the political elite and the governing elite were unable or unwilling or both to address the fundamental needs of their own people. And this is quite astounding, but it's a reality. So Macron came twice and last time gave the government a list of things that the government had to do before the international community was going to provide any aid funds. Because to fix the economy and stabilize things and return to a growth path, the government needs about $30 billion, at least to begin with. That money is available in theory from donors and aid groups and IMF and other UN and others. That money is available, but it will only be given to Lebanon if the government carries out a set of really clear, stringent economic reforms of the issues I mentioned: energy, water, electric, etc., and ending corruption and fixing the banking system. The government is unable or unwilling to do that, and it's very bizarre. We don't know exactly who is blocking it. All the political leaders, all the sectarian leaders at the top say, oh, I'm all for reform, it's this guy's fault, or they're blocking this, or everybody blames somebody else, which is how the system has run for the last 30 years. People don't take responsibility for the consequences of their own action or inaction, in many cases, don't admit that they're part of the corrupt system, and blame somebody else, and then expect somebody to come from outside to help. Well, the fact is that people historically did come from outside to help. So whether it was the Saudis or the Americans or the Europeans or the Iranians come and help, especially Hezbollah and the Shiites or others, and Iran does help the government as well a little bit, but there always has been external support that came in and saved, or the Syrians at one point when they were in charge, external forces did save the country several times, but no more. And this is the stark reality. Nobody, neither the people of Lebanon, nor the major international agencies, nor the traditional bilateral donors, nobody trusts this Lebanese ruling elite. They see them as incompetent crooks. They see them as corrupt, inefficient warlords who have run the country into the ground. And then on top of all of this, you get this explosion in the port on August 4th. And then you had this fire in the port a few days last week. And there's been 2 or 3 more fires in Beirut today, in the last week. And people are wondering, is somebody setting these fires intentionally, or nobody knows exactly? They're looking into them. So the explosion of August 4 was such an immense example of the 2 things that the Lebanese have had to endure. One was the mass human suffering in all dimensions of life: physical destruction, people's being killed or injured, their houses destroyed, their economic system jolted, and an example of the uncaring, inefficient government system that allowed this to happen by allowing the 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate to be stored in the port for 6 years, knowing that this was extremely dangerous and could blow up, and in fact it did blow up. So the uncaring attitude of the government, combined with another example of huge suffering, just took people over the edge and people over the top. And people were out in the streets about 3 weeks ago with hangman's nooses. They put up in the center of Beirut a gallows, and hanging from the gallows were, with actual hanging nooses, full life replicas of the political leaders themselves. You had a picture of Saad Hariri, of Hassan Nasrallah, of Nabih Berri, of Michel Aoun, the president. All of the leaders were hanging on hangman's nooses in the middle of Beirut as an extreme symbol of how angry the people were and what they wanted to happen. So what did the government do? It sent in the troops and tear gas and a couple of shots and pushed them out. And so that's where we are. So this is the situation in Lebanon. But the scary thing is that this is a situation that also mirrors conditions in several other Arab countries. But the underlying trends that brought us to this situation are prevalent in much of the region, where governments are either uncaring and corrupt at the same time, or uncaring, corrupt, and incompetent at the same time, where individuals run ministries and government agencies, make a lot of money and have a lot of power and are not accountable to anybody. So that's common across the region. That has led to increasing poverty. About 75% of the people of the Arab world today are classified by the UN as poor or vulnerable. And that's gone up now probably another 5% because of the impact of Corona, the complete stopping of trade, tourism, foreign investment, remittances, all the sources of money that came into the non-oil producing countries have slowed down or stopped. So poverty is increasing. We can probably assume that around 80%, 4 out of every 5 Arabs is poor and has trouble making ends meet, let alone living a good life. And the governments seem to be unable or unwilling to do anything about it. Not every Arab country is like this, but certainly at least 3/4 of them are. The smaller countries that have oil and gas reserves, smaller populations, more focused leaderships are much better than some of the other ones like Lebanon or Syria or Yemen or Libya. Of course, you have countries at war, Iraq, countries that have suffered massive warfare and refugee flows on top of everything else. So that's the situation we're at. And I would say what this tells me, as somebody who has lived through this for the last 50 years or so in the Middle East, I've lived through this history. It tells me that most of the Arab states, with almost no exceptions, maybe just 1 or 2, most of them have failed the tests of citizenship and statehood and sovereignty. These are countries that cannot run themselves well. They can only run themselves if there's a corrupt, dictatorial, authoritarian elite, or just in some cases one person at the top of the country holding it together, like a gang or a militia, with one person enforcing the rules and nobody else has any authority. This is a terrible verdict, but this is the reality that we see, and that's why with about 80% poverty across the entire region, you have this tremendous inequality with the masses of poor and a small, very rich elite, and very little hope among citizens, and no rights, no ability to bring about change. So that's the bad news. The good news is that people have responded now, challenge this, and demand that it be changed. And we had the initial uprisings of 2010 and 11, and then we have the bigger ones that are going on now in Algeria and Sudan, Iraq and Lebanon. The Sudan case is the most important to note, because the Sudanese were able to bring down the government and then force the military into a transitional arrangement where there's a governing council that has six military and 6 civilians on it, and a 13th person who's chosen by the civilians. And therefore there is a symbolic civilian dominance over the governing council, over the transitional system, but the military is still strong in the background and involved in running the country. They have this 3-year transition that was negotiated between the people who were demonstrating and the government that was trying to stop them from achieving their goals. And hundreds, 600-700 people died in Sudan. The government shot the demonstrators, but the demonstrators wouldn't go away. They kept coming back. They got organized better than in any other Arab country. They had a coordinated leadership council run by the professional unions, the doctors, the lawyers, the engineers, and they created a mechanism to engage with the government. When it was clear that they were not going to go away, they kept having strikes and demonstrations. They brought the country to a halt. They forced the president, Omar Hassan al-Bashir, to resign, the military ruler. He was put in jail. He's going on trial now. And the military was forced into this transitional governance arrangement. So this is one of the few really hopeful signs. And I think this is what we need to keep our eye on in Lebanon and Iraq, possibly. Iraq is more complicated for different reasons because of the involvement of Iran and other issues. But in Lebanon, the demonstrators have immense power, but they haven't been able to channel it into a political transition. They haven't been able to force the government to meet them halfway. And we don't know how this is going to end up. And right now, it's this moment where Macron has presented his demands. The demands are very similar to what the protesters want, but put in a more polite French diplomatic language, not hangman's nooses, but essentially saying that the political elite has to change or get out of the way. And we'll see what comes out of that process. So this is where we are now. And it's hard to know where it's going to go, but it can't stay like this for sure, because the country will completely collapse economically and socially and politically, which, by the way, won't happen because the only thing that remains different today than in Lebanon than other Arab countries is the presence of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a very powerful Shiite group that has a political component, a military component, and a social support component to mostly for the Shiite community, but also others who live with them. And Hezbollah is immensely powerful. It's the only group that has forced Israel militarily twice into a ceasefire and has created a deterrent situations along the Israeli-Lebanese border. No other Arab government or group has been able to do that. And Hezbollah is the most powerful political group behind the scenes and in coalition with its allies, who include Christian and Sunni and other groups. How Hezbollah decides to move is going to be the determining factor, I believe, in where the political standoff moves to in the coming weeks and months. But it's got to move somewhere. So let me stop there, and then I'm happy to hear comments, questions, discussions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rami. If you don't mind, before we get to the particular questions, I'd like to ask you to give a little bit more background on, you rightly point out that the crisis in Lebanon is mainly the fault of Lebanese misrule and elites, local elites. But I think to round out the picture, we have to understand historically that the roots of some of these problems go back to the colonial era, and also have been affected by the intervention and interference in Lebanon by its immediate and more distant neighbors, and first of all, Israel, and the relation of the Palestine-Israel, battle, a historical battle that has spilled over into Lebanon. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that, and the interference of the United States. I think I heard you suggest that the United States had tried to help Lebanon at different points. I guess I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but that's not the way I understand it. So I wonder if you'd elaborate, in terms of a little bit more background. You mentioned the influence of Syria on Lebanon, but what about Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and so on? And of course, historically, the French, who kind of set up the trajectory that Lebanon is going through now.
Yeah, you're correct. Now, I didn't mean to say that that the U.S. has tried to help Lebanon. It has, to be fair to the U.S., it's given aid often to the police and the army, but low-level stuff, bullets and helicopters. They don't give Lebanon any serious military aid because they don't want a serious political power next to Israel. But of course, that has backfired because the weakness of the Lebanese military and the weakness of the Lebanese political system's will to fight against Israeli attacks and threats has been one of the big reasons why Hezbollah came to being. After the Israeli occupation of Lebanon in the early South Lebanon in the early 1980s, that was really when Hezbollah came into being. It started well before that as a local movement of self-help and raising the Shiites from the bottom rung of life in Lebanon to more rights. And there were Israeli incursions and attacks on Lebanon from the late 60s in the south and other places. And the Palestinian-Israeli conflict spilled over into Lebanon in two forms. You had several 100,000 Palestinian refugees who came to Lebanon from Palestine in 47, 48 and have stayed there and grown. And then you had the continuous Israeli attacks in the south against Palestinian groups who were guerrillas who were trying to use the South to carry out pretty small-scale attacks against Israelis, but still small-scale attacks. The Israelis didn't want that to happen, and therefore kept attacking Lebanon, bombing it, occupying it, threatening it, and at one point set up a surrogate South Lebanese army that it funded and trained, etc. So the direct impact of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict on Lebanon has been significant over the years, but because of the Lebanese government's weakness in protecting Lebanon from Israel, Hezbollah grew to play that role, and with huge amount of assistance from Iran. So the bigger problem for Lebanon with foreign, let's call it engagement or intervention or interference in Lebanon, is that there have been many foreign powers who've done that, who've gone into Lebanon to try to secure their own interests. And the Lebanese have always welcomed this. So it's not as if poor Lebanon was preyed upon by these foreign predators. The Lebanese, going back to the 19th century, different sectarian groups, religious groups, who felt that they were threatened or something, called on foreign people to support them, whether it was, the Russians or the French or the Vatican or somebody else. And in modern times, this became the money of the Sunnis looking to Saudi Arabia for help, and the Shiites looking to Iran for help, and others looking to the French. And the French, as a colonial power, were involved, as I said, in helping to create Lebanon. It wasn't all their fault that this bizarre system was used, but they played a major role in it. And the French have always had a kind of historical guilt and responsibility, having been the mandated power and having seen this happen. I think they've always felt that they have a certain responsibility. So every time Lebanon had a catastrophe, it would often, in modern times, it would look to Paris. And sure enough, that's still going on, to the point where the French president had to come twice to Lebanon and meet with ordinary people in the area of the devastation of the bomb, which the government officials in Lebanon did not do, but the French president did. So this is kind of symbolic of the fact that foreign interference has been a recurring cause of Lebanon's development in terms of money and support and technical aid, but a recurring cause also of its slow destruction, which we see today. And the biggest, the Saudis have pretty much gotten fed up with the Sunnis they supported, because most of the Sunnis they supported, like Hariri and others, just haven't done very well. They're not very good politicians. They're not very good leaders. And the Americans, the French, others who supported people pretty much do it in a low-key way. And they leave it more now to the international agencies like the IMF and the World Bank to come in, and the UN, except for the Iranians who are supporting Hezbollah. That's the biggest external link in the country. The Israelis have always tried to develop a Lebanese partner. They mostly tried with the Christians. And for a few years there in the 1980s, they were able to do that. But then, and they had set up their own surrogate army, as I said, but it didn't last for long, because the majority of Lebanese see Israel as a predator or danger, and so that's where we are today. The Lebanese continue by their own actions to show that they are unable or unwilling to manage their country properly, which is really bizarre, because as I said at the beginning, what the Lebanese did from 1930 to 1970 was really quite impressive in national development terms, human development terms, cultural and political development and social development, and engineering and professional development, education. In every field of life, the Lebanese did really impressive national development with a good amount of social equity, with minimum corruption. But that was 60, 70 years ago. Those days are gone. Today, there's a different kind of leadership, and it's brought the country to the mess that it's in right now.
Thank you, Rami. We're going to go to some of the questions in the chat. But before I do, there's one comment rather than a question, which I think reflects what some people are saying in Lebanon itself. I hope it's more or less ironic, but you do hear it. One of our participants says, "I wish France can come back and rule us." I,
You hear this?
I'm not sure that's the solution, but I know many people in Lebanon are saying that.
Oh
I
my
think it's a
God.
cry of anguish and despair, but not a proposal.
It's true. Many people are saying it. It's not literally a request, but it shows you the desperation and exasperation
Yeah.
of the Lebanese. What the Lebanese people have been through is really something that nobody in the world should have to experience.
Yeah.
This decades of warfare, occupation, corruption, bad governance, degraded life quality, to the point today where the system is completely collapsed, and they can't even get on with their day-to-day needs very easily at all. And then you get this bomb explosion, this port explosion, then you get these fires. It's like Job in the Bible, where, you know, it's as if somebody is testing Lebanon to see how much pain it can endure, and it keeps sending different waves of calamities against it. But the Lebanese, you know, despite all of these um, calamities, what you see in Lebanon, and you see it when you live there, as I have and do, and it's not reported very well in the international media, this extraordinary human spirit that the Lebanese have, this dynamism that created a wonderful country in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it's still there. It's in their genes, it's in their blood, and it's there because they're human beings. It's not that the Lebanese are better or more talented than Egyptians or Jordanians or Saudis. They're not. It's just that they had the more freedom to bring their humanity to life. And therefore, there's this dynamism, this self-reliance, this people taking initiatives, a very strong civil society sector, a strong private sector, and this kicks in now. You see it. Immediately after the explosion. You saw it before the explosion. I just finished writing a long 10,000-word analysis of the 4 different Arab uprisings I mentioned, which included Lebanon, which will come out in a few weeks.
I hope you'll share that with us when it's out.
I'll share it with you when it comes out. You saw it before the explosion and even before the October protests last year. As poverty grew and more people were in need, you saw incredible amounts of local self-help initiatives, people helping each other, helping the needy, helping the neighbors, helping the poor, helping somebody who needs money for medicine, somebody who needs a job, somebody whose house needs repair and they don't have the money to do it. And after the explosion, you had an explosion of human help, self-help, helping each other, empathy, solidarity, compassion, people coming out of nowhere from all over Lebanon with brooms to sweep up the debris and help people fix their houses. After the people with brooms came and went, the carpenters came, and then the window fixers. All these people came and went to people's homes and said, "Do you need help? We're here to help you." Universities, AUB and others went around, their engineers went around looking at buildings saying, "This building is structurally sound, you can fix it. This one is danger, you got to be careful." Things that the government should have done but wasn't doing. So this incredible indigenous human capacity for empathy and rebirth and rehabilitation came out very, very strongly in the past year. And it's there now on the ground. And you see these institutions, organizations that spring up spontaneously. And some of them have been there for decades, others are brand new. So that's a side of Lebanon that is not clear to the international community, mainly because the media doesn't do a very good job of portraying it.
So, Rami, with your indulgence and the rest, if we can go till 8:30 and get to some of the questions, is that okay with you?
Okay, I'll get to catch the end of the Red Sox game.
You won't be missing much, probably. From Munir, he says, while the media blames the crisis in Lebanon solely on corruption, the U.S. government has unleashed a maximum pressure campaign to push regime change and crush Lebanese resistance with sanctions and aggressive hybrid warfare. Can you comment on that?
Yes, the American government in the Middle East, the Arab world, and Iran has no idea what it's doing. I've watched the American government in action. I've known many officials in the government. I still do. I've met with them over the years as a journalist. And I've watched them closely in the US and in the Middle East. They have no idea what they're doing. They don't understand the social dynamics. They don't understand the history. They don't understand the politics. And this is heightened by what you saw today, this rather circus show at the White House of the Bahraini and Emirati governments signing an agreement with Israel under the tutelage of Donald Trump and his sidekick, Jared Kushner, saying this is a great peace breakthrough, which is it's nothing of the sort. This is a great attempt to have electoral support for Trump and a Netanyahu who are desperately fighting for their political lives. But this is just an example of how the pressure on Iran, the invasion of Iraq, the military use in Syria, helping the Emiratis and Saudis bomb Yemen to smithereens, now to the point where people are seriously exploring war crime charges against American officials. And that's why the United States wants to try to break the International Criminal Court, which it can't, of course. So anything the United States does, including the sanctions on Syria, the sanctions in Lebanon, is really the stuff of Saturday morning cartoons. It should not be taken seriously. It is not done by people who know what they're doing. It is heavily, heavily driven by right-wing Israeli Zionist extremist groups like the ones that rule Israel now. And it is increasingly driven by similarly right-wing extremist evangelical Christian groups in the United States who know less about the Arab world than even Donald Trump. And these evangelical Christian extremists are real wild men, and they just are extremely destructive in terms of getting involved in political actions in the Middle East. And they essentially are one of the most important groups for Trump now, because he's losing his support among other important swing groups that he needs for his election. But the evangelical Christian groups they maybe have 50, 60 million people in the US, and he sees them as an important electoral support. And they are almost totally supporting, not all of them, but most of them are totally supporting not just Israel, but the right-wing extremists in Israel, the settlers and the messianic super nationalists. And so these situations are extremely obvious when you look at them, when people see what's going on in the Middle East and they see American policy. Anybody who knows what's going on does not take seriously what the US is trying to do, because it doesn't work. It's not going to succeed.
Thank you. I think most of us would probably agree with that. As bad as things can be in the Middle East, when the US intervenes, it makes it worse, generally speaking. So here's another question.
Well, except the Iran agreement was a really good deal. When the US uses diplomacy wisely, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
So
that was a diplomacy rather than intervention, I guess.
Right, but military intervention and sanctions, which are now the favored tactic, have almost always failed to achieve their goal. Not just failed, they've brought counterproductive results. So the pressure on Iran for all these years. Iran is much stronger in the region today than it was 15 years ago. It's quite extraordinary. The pressures on Hezbollah, it just doesn't work. Well, I said what I said, so I don't have to repeat it.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of who's getting stronger, when the smoke clears, if it ever does, eventually, it looks as though China will play a much bigger role in the Middle East than it has. And that's something that worries a lot of American elites and government as well. They're already playing a big role in Syria and may play a big role economically in terms of Lebanon also, if the US will allow them, which is a question. So here's another question, kind of gets to the core of what your presentation was. It says, all the basic needs of life, water, electricity in Lebanon have not been provided to the citizens for more than 20 years. It's true that citizens were rioting for some time. However, during the last election, they elected the same corrupt government. We are tribal. How can we change this, in your opinion? That's from a
Well,
Lebanese person.
this is the big question. How does this change? The reality is that the people who have tried through the electoral system to bring about a change in government, to get better government, have failed, mainly because the people in power have been able to control the voting system, the electoral system, and the money and the doling out goodies to such an extent that they've always been able to maintain a big majority in government. So the last election that happened, there was 2 or 3 independents who were elected out of 128 members of parliament, a meaningless quantity. So this is why the protests have demanded now a total removal of the political class. They're not, and they want new elections with a new election law that is non-sectarian, not based on religious identity, and they want a government system that's secular, and they want an independent judiciary that can watch over all of this, and stronger anti-corruption methods. They want these things to happen sequentially, and then electing a new president. But they see the election of a new parliament using a new, more fair electoral law as the critical link to any transition that may happen. There's no sign of this happening, but there are signs that the political elite is starting to understand what they're being asked to do. They don't want to make these changes because it means they'll be out of power. But they may or may not have an option. We'll have to see. But you've had interesting statements from political leaders in Lebanon. The president and Hariri, the prime minister, even Hezbollah, they've said in the last 8-9 months, oh yeah, we're all for a non-sectarian election law. We're all for strengthening the anti-corruption system. We're all for a different mechanism that reduces the sectarian power in the cabinet and brings in more efficient technocrats. They all say that under pressure, but none of them have actually done it yet. So if you believe, as I do, that rhetoric is the first step towards action, the fact that some senior Lebanese people are talking about these issues is not just that they feel they have to respond to the people in the streets who are hanging their effigies on nooses. They understand that they have to make substantive changes, but they don't want to do it. And they're trying to resist making the changes. So that the change is going to have to come because the system cannot continue. Lebanon cannot exist like this for more than another 6 months or so. The government has no money, the people has no patience, the people have medicines are running out. I mean, it's an unbelievable situation. And life goes on because everybody helps everybody else. So you run out of food, your neighbor's going to help you, or your cousin, or somebody, your cousin abroad is going to send you some money. But it's all private donations, people helping each other. But the structural underpinnings, not only of governance and institutional organizational life in the country, but of fundamental family-based human life, those underpinnings are deteriorating daily. And they're not going to stop deteriorating if the situation stays like this. And that's why I believe we really have about 2 months to show if there's going to be movement to real change or no movement. And the movement to real change, I believe, will not be a dramatic one-shot overhaul of the whole system. I believe it's going to be an incremental process where, for instance, the prime minister now who has been designated is an unknown guy and doesn't have any black marks on him other than he was named by the political elite. But he's tried to put together a cabinet of technocrats and didn't get very far. He got some people, but they couldn't fully agree. So it sounds like he's going to step down in the next day or two. So we'll see who the next person that comes in has to come quickly. My guess is you're going to probably get because of the urgency of the doomsday scenario that everybody sees in front of them, you're going to probably get a transitional technocratic government with exceptional powers that allows it to deal with the most urgent immediate issues, which is stabilizing the Lebanese currency, coming up with a new election law, doing a forensic analysis of the central bank and to try to find out where the $80 billion that was missing, where it went, who stole it, who put it overseas in banks, where is it, and then stabilizing the economy and helping the economy grow again, and supporting the needs of the poor. Those 5 issues are the ones that must be addressed quickly, including energy and garbage collection with them. So my guess is they'll start with a limited government of technocrats addressing some of these issues just enough so that ordinary people will feel some improvement in their life. If the Lebanese pound stabilizes, that'll be a huge first step. It'll allow people then to know, okay, I've got this much money, I can do it, I don't have to panic. And then other things will happen. Donors will start bringing their money in, helping the government. But there has to be a new system where money cannot just be given to the government, because people don't trust the government, even a new government. They want accounting and accountability mechanisms to make sure that donor money is spent efficiently to help the Lebanese people and not to enrich the ruling elite. So we'll have to see if and when this happens or not.
Okay, we'll get to another question, but by the way, for those of you who have never been to Lebanon, if you want to get a little bit of the flavor of what the reality of daily life in Beirut has been, not just lately, but over a long period, with very bad or non-existent public services. There's an article I give you the link to in the chat that I wrote some years ago called "Is Lebanon the Tea Party Utopia?" That is a country without a real government, which may be the direction we're going into in our own country as well. So the next question is, were the Israelis involved in the August 4th explosion?
Nobody knows. The investigation has been done locally so far with a little bit of help from abroad, including the FBI and stuff. This is one of the problems. People don't know what's going on. The government is not telling people even about the explosion. They said it's an accident. There was some welders. They inadvertently sparked some fireworks that lit up, and then those blew up ignited the ammonium nitrate. Most people don't believe the government. They simply don't believe it. They want to know exactly what has been found, and the people have still been demanding an international investigation. They don't trust their own government to do the investigation. There's been about, I think, 25 people who have been detained and questioned by the Lebanese authorities, and these are more lower level people, and the fear is that they're going to pick a few lower level people, put the blame on them, put them in jail, and then leave the upper echelon leaders to go scot-free, because the president, the prime minister, all kinds of ministers, the judiciary, they all knew about this. The police, the army, they all knew about these stored ammonium nitrate bags, and they did nothing about them. And people really don't want to have a few lower level bureaucrats take the blame and let the big fish go scot-free.
So here's another question, which maybe you've already answered. Is there leadership among the protesters in Lebanon?
Yes, the problem is there's so much leadership that it's not organized into a single leadership. And this is a huge debate that's been going on since the protest started last October. There are dozens and dozens of superb young middle-aged people who are leading the different protest groups. There's probably 100 different groups, civil society groups, that are active in different areas. One of the important dimensions of the protests, and this is again in Lebanon and the region, is that unlike previous protests that over the last 40 years, where you had single issue protests, like school teachers would go on strike for better pay, or retired army officers would go on strike for better benefits, or drivers would go on strike to increase their fares that they could charge, or whatever, or milk prices went up and people went on strike. Those single issue protests were easily handled by the state, and those protests and demonstrations got nowhere, usually. This time, you've got every possible group in the country that has a legitimate grievance or a legitimate rights issue working together to create a really national protest movement, and protesting as national citizens of Lebanon, demanding the rights of citizenship. And so you've got people protesting about food, about income, about jobs, electricity. Then you've got special interest groups like LGBTQ, you've got women's rights groups, you've got student groups, retired teachers, environmentalists, secular law protesters. All these different special interest groups are now working together. And this is one of the things that gives this movement strength, but it also is a source of weakness, because there isn't a single identified leadership. The demands of the protest movement are very clear. There is a single set of demands, and it's been published many times by different people. It's very clear what people want, and I mentioned the main points. But there isn't a single group of individuals who can be identified as the leadership with whom the government would be forced to negotiate, as happened in Sudan. So this is hugely discussed these days in Lebanon, and people realize, many of the people who are in the protest movement that I've spoken to over the last 10 months are increasingly saying, we need to create a mechanism to engage the government to bring about the transition we want to happen. And many people are saying, no, we shouldn't do that, because one reason people are hesitant to do that is because they're afraid that if they identify 5 or 6 leaders, then they'll be assassinated. Very simple as that, because this is a common tradition, unfortunately, in the region, and people will be assassinated. Or they'll be co-opted. They'll be, these people will say, oh, why don't you come and be Minister of Public Works? And so they don't want to do that. They don't want to name a small group of people, but they realize that they can't just continue like they are now. So it's wrong to say that this is a leaderless protest. It's a protest with a bounty of leaders, but there's so many of them, they're not organized in one group.
Too many leaders. The next question is, how has the 1.5 million Syrian refugees, what problems have they caused in Lebanon?
Refugees in every country, and I've experienced this in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and Palestine, Iraq. I've seen it firsthand. We've had many refugee flows within our region, within the Levant, because you had wars in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine. So there's been plenty, and then you had people coming out of Kuwait when they were invaded, and people coming out of Yemen and Somalia. So the reality of refugees is that they, first of all, they are usually welcomed in these Arab countries at first, and this is normal. It's happened many times over. After a while, they start to create stresses in the eyes of some of the host people. So you've got people in Lebanon today basically accusing the Syrian refugees of taking jobs away from Lebanese, or bringing down the wages of Lebanese workers, or stressing the electricity and water systems or school systems. And this is exactly what they used to say about Palestinian refugees years ago. And it's exactly what Jordanians said about Lebanese when the Lebanese came to Jordan in the Lebanese war. And I was in Jordan then. I remember Lebanese people coming. We had a great Lebanese man who came and ran the printing press at the Jordan Times when I was editor, and he was terrific, as all Lebanese printing technicians are. And we saw the Lebanese coming in, and then the Iraqis came in when there was war in Iraq. And the Jordanians were saying the same thing about the Iraqis. They're raising rent prices, they're lowering the wage labors. So the reality at the same time is that the host countries always benefit from the refugees in two ways. The refugees always provide a pool of cheap labor and usually skilled labor, and the host countries take advantage of this. And the refugees almost always bring in billions of dollars of international aid to help meet their needs. And this has been documented well in Lebanon's case by ESCWA, the Economic and Social Commission for West Asia, UN agency. They, about 6 years ago, they did some studies showing that the Syrian presence in Lebanon actually contributed about 2% to GDP, which is quite extraordinary, both in lowering wage costs and bringing in aid money. And that aid money that went to the refugees was spent in Lebanon on food and clothes and whatever. So it's really a double-edged sword. So my own assessment of this is that refugees end up being a neutral factor, except that they continue to be an easy scapegoat for political actors, whether in Lebanon or Jordan or Iraq or Syria, wherever they may be. They're an easy scapegoat. You can always blame the refugees. And most of that blame usually is not correct and is done for political purposes.
As you know, and some of our participants may or may not know, there were certainly a lot of Syrians working in Lebanon before the Syrian civil war, and in such numbers, I don't know if anyone ever knew the exact numbers, but my experience is that if you were in Lebanon in the early 2000s, anybody carrying some bricks or using a broom or doing physical labor, chances are they were Syrian rather than Lebanese.
There's probably about 250,000 of them before the war. Yeah.
So, and of course they worked hard, you know, and you know, it was like immigrant labor in the United States. They worked hard and
right.
sometimes were resented even then, before the refugees. Although most Lebanese were happy to have someone else do the physical labor whenever it was possible. I think that's still a factor in Lebanon. The next question, one theory says that Macron came to Lebanon worried about potential influence of Turkey coming in and creating the same competition as in Libya. What's your comment on that?
The Turkish political, military, cultural expansion, economic expansion around the Middle East is really one of the most important recent developments in our region, coupled with the expansion of Emirati military adventurism across the region. You see this in Libya, you see it in Yemen, you see it in other places. I don't think that Turks have much of an opportunity to play a major role in Lebanon. First of all, because they're Turks. Arab Sunni powers would have a bigger chance of doing that. Say the Saudis or the Qataris or the Kuwaitis if they wanted, or the Egyptians, but the Egyptians don't have any money. But so I don't think that Turkey has a direct major role to play in Lebanon. The concern of Macron is the Turkish maritime expansion, the agreement with Libya and sending oil exploration ships around Cyprus. So the oil and gas wealth of the East Mediterranean is now a big issue. And you've got the Turks, the Greeks, the Italians, the French, the Israelis. Many people are looking at this and, you know, trying to grab their share. But I think the main driver of Macron's intervention was post-colonial French guilt and a sense of using this as a way to expand France's role on the global stage by doing something that could help Lebanon and that would raise France's stature across the world in a diplomatic sense. And of course, he, in the back of his mind is always the idea that if he can get the crisis solved and get the country back on a growth pattern, there's going to be lots and lots of reconstruction contracts. And the French would be well placed to get a lot of those.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I guess, can we have one more question? Asking Brian and Cole, is that okay? Just going in order. Is there, and relevant to what your comment just now, is there any chance that Syria and Lebanon can find some time or some capability to a federated reconstruction?
I kind of doubt it in the present circumstances. Under different leaderships, that would make a lot of sense. But I don't see it possibly happening under the current Syrian and Lebanese leaderships. They have to take care of their own affairs for the moment, and then eventually they have to go back to the situation where they were very close economically, because they're very close culturally and demographically and geographically. But for the moment, the political differences are quite vast. And people in Lebanon, many people, I would say, have a bad memory of Syria's running Lebanon for 15 years after, well, during and after the Civil War for 25 years. But people are not ready to work closely with Syria in many parts of Lebanon.
I guess there's a sense in Lebanon that an understanding that many Syrians have never accepted the legitimacy of the French division of Syria and the creation of Lebanon. Some people even in Lebanon agree with that, but that creates a certain tension, right? I mean, there's a
little bit, but I mean, people have pretty much adjusted to the realities of their borders, even though they may not have liked the way they were done, or they didn't feel that there was sufficient self-determination in drawing these borders. But you know, that was 100 years ago. So I don't think that's a big issue anymore.
Yeah, good. Well, apologies to those people who posted questions that we didn't get to, but I think we can't impose on Rami any more than the time we've already allotted. So I want to thank you, Rami, and all those of you who have participated. Maybe we can do this again sometime. There are a lot of issues that we could spend more time going into. Obviously, it's more than you could cover in an hour and a half. And for those of you who are participating who don't know about Massachusetts Peace Action, if you're interested in joining or supporting our work, you can look for us online as Massachusetts Peace Action, and on our website, you'll see ways of joining or participating in our work. We have a Middle East task force working group and a Palestine-Israel working group, among many other issues that we support. So Rami, I thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us, and I hope I'll see you maybe around here before you leave, and God willing, in Beirut sometime this spring.
Okay, well, thank you, especially to Jeff, Brian, and Cole for putting this together, and for all of you for attending. And I'm always happy to interact with fine people like you.
Thank you. Bravo. Okay, good night, everyone. Bye. Thank you, Rami.
Good night.
Good night.